Oh, I'm forgetting him. Come downstairs with me, poor itty dog, and it shall have its tea. It shall." In a few minutes she returned, bland and benignant as before, but I thought she had forgotten to give the poor itty doggy anything to eat, judging by the avidity with which he swallowed down chance pieces of cake. The tea tray was abundantly loaded. I was pleased to see it. I was so hungry, but I was afraid the ladies present might think it vulgarly heaped up. I know they would have done at their own houses, but somehow the heaps disappeared here. I saw Miss Jameson eating seed cake slowly and considerately, as she did everything, and I was rather surprised, for I knew she had told us on the occasion of her last party that she never had it in her house. It reminded her so much of scented soap. She always gave us savory biscuits. However, Miss Jameson was kindly indulgent to Miss Barker's want of knowledge of the customs of high life, and to spare her feelings, ate 3 large pieces of seed cake, with a placid, ruminating expression of countenance, not unlike a cow's. After tea there was some little demur and difficulty, which were 6 in number. 4 could play at preference, and for the other 2 there was cribbage. But all, except myself, I was rather afraid of the Cranford ladies at cards, for it was the most earnest and serious business they have ever engaged in, were anxious to be of the pool. Even Miss Barker, who, declaring she did not know Spadille from Manille, was evidently hankering to take a hand. The dilemma was soon put an end to by a singular kind of noise. If a baron's daughter-in-law could ever be supposed to snore, I should have said Miss Jameson did so then, for, overcome by the heat of the room, and inclined to doze by nature, the temptation of that very comfortable armchair had been too much for her, and Miss Jameson was nodding. Once or twice she opened her eyes with an effort, and calmly but unconsciously smiled upon us, but by and by, even by her benevolence, was not equal to this exertion, and she was sound asleep. "It is very gratifying to me," whispered Miss Barker at the card table to her 3 opponents, whom, notwithstanding her ignorance of the game, she was basting most unmercifully, "very gratifying indeed to see how completely Miss Jameson feels at home in my poor little dwelling. She could not have paid me a greater compliment." Miss Barker provided me with some literature in the shape of 3 or 4 handsomely bound fashion books, 10 or 12 years old, observing, as she put a little table and a candle for my especial benefit, that she knew young people liked to look at pictures. Carlo lay and snorted, and started at his mistress's feet. He, too, was quite at home. The card table was an animated scene to watch. 4 ladies' heads, with noodling caps, all nearly meeting over the middle of the table in their eagerness to whisper quick enough and loud enough, and every now and then came Miss Barker's "Hush, ladies, if you please, hush, Miss Jameson is asleep." It was very difficult to steer clear between Miss Forrester's deafness and Miss Jameson's sleepiness, but Miss Barker managed her arduous task well. She repeated the whisper to Miss Forrester, distorting her face considerably in order to show, by the motion of her lips, what was said, and then she smiled kindly all round at us, and murmured to herself, "Very gratifying indeed. I wish my poor sister had been alive to see this day." Presently the door was thrown wide open. Carlo started to his feet with a loud snapping bark, and Miss Jameson awoke, or perhaps she had not been asleep. As she said almost directly, the room had been so light she had been glad to keep her eyes shut, but had been listening with great interest to all our amusing and agreeable conversation. Peggy came in once more, red with importance. "Another tray? Oh, gentility," thought I, "can you endure this shock?" For Miss Barker had ordered, nay, I doubt not, prepared, although she did say, "Why, Peggy, what have you brought us?" and looked pleasantly surprised at the unexpected pleasure. All sorts of good things for supper: scalloped oyster, potted lobster, jelly, a dish called Little Cupids, which was in great favor with the Cranford ladies, although too expensive to be given except on solemn and state occasions, macaroons sopped in brandy, I should have called it, if I had not known its more refined and classical name. In short, we were evidently to be feasted with all that was sweetest and best, and we thought it better to submit graciously, even at the cost of our gentility, which never ate suppers in general, but which, like most non-supper eaters, was particularly hungry on all special occasions. Miss Barker in her former sphere had, I dare say, been made acquainted with the beverage they called cherry brandy. We none of us had ever seen such a thing, and rather shrank back when she proffered us. Just a little glass, ladies, after the oyster and lobsters, you know. Shellfish are sometimes thought not very wholesome. We all shook our heads like female mandarins, but at last Miss Jameson suffered herself to be persuaded, and we followed her lead. It was not exactly unpalatable, though so hot and so strong that we thought ourselves bound to give evidence that we were not accustomed to such things by coughing terribly, almost as strangely as Miss Barker had done, before we were admitted by Peggy. "It's very strong," said Miss Pole, as she put down her empty glass. "I do believe there's spirits in it." "Only a little drop, just necessary to make it keep," said Miss Barker. "You know we put brandy pepper over our preserves to make them keep. I often feel tipsy myself from eating damson tart." I question whether damson tart would have opened Miss Jameson's heart as the cherry brandy did, but she told us of a coming event, respecting which she had been quite silent till that moment. "My sister-in-law, Lady Glenmire, is coming to stay with me." There was a chorus of "Indeed!" and then a pause. Each one rapidly reviewed her wardrobe, as to its fitness to appear in the presence of a baron's widow, for, of course, a series of small festivals were always held in Cranford on the arrival of a visitor at any of our friends' houses. We felt very pleasantly excited on the present occasion. Not long after this, the maids and the lanterns were announced. Miss Jameson had the sedan chair, which had squeezed itself into Miss Barker's narrow lobby with some difficulty, and most literally stopped the way. It required some skillful maneuvering on the part of the old chairman. Shoemakers by day, but when summoned to carry the sedan dressed up in a strange old livery, it required some skillful maneuvering on the part of the old chairman, to edge and back and try it again, and finally to succeed in carrying their burdens out of Miss Barker's front door. Then we heard their quick pit-a-pat along the quiet little street as we put on our calashes and pinned up our gowns, Miss Barker hovering about us with offers of help, which, if she had not remembered her former occupation and wished us to forget it, would have been much more pressing. Chapter 8. Your Ladyship. Early the next morning, directly at 12, Miss Pole made her appearance at Miss Mattie's. Some very trifling pieces of business was alleged as a reason for the call, but there was evidently something behind it. At last, out it came. "By the way, you'll think I'm strangely ignorant, but do you really know? I am puzzled how we ought to address Lady Glenmire. Do you say 'your ladyship' where you would say 'you' to a common person? I've been puzzling all morning, and are we to say 'my lady' instead of 'ma'am'? Now you knew Lady Arley. Will you kindly tell me the most correct way of speaking to the peerage?" Poor Miss Mattie! She took off her spectacles and she put them on again, but how Lady Arley was addressed she could not remember. "It is so long ago," she said. "Dear, dear, how stupid I am! I don't think I ever saw her more than twice. I know we used to call Sir Peter, but he came much oftener to see us than Lady Arley did. Deborah would have known in a minute. My lady, your ladyship. It sounds very strange, and as if it was not normal. I never thought of it before, but now you have named it, I am all in a puzzle." It was very certain Miss Pole would obtain no wise decision from Miss Mattie, who got more bewildered every moment, and more perplexed as to the etiquette of address. "Well, I really think," said Miss Pole, "I had better just go and tell Miss Forrester about our little difficulty. One sometimes grows nervous, and yet one would not have Lady Glenmire think we were quite ignorant of the etiquettes of high life in Cranford. And will you just step in here, dear Miss Pole, as you come back, please, and tell me what you decide upon. Whatever you and Miss Forrester fix upon will be quite right, I'm sure. Lady Arley, Sir Peter," said Miss Mattie to herself, trying to recall the old form of words. "Who is Lady Glenmire?" asked I. "Oh, she's the widow of Mr. Jameson. That's Miss Jameson's late husband, you know, widow of his eldest brother. Miss Jameson was a Miss Walker, daughter of Governor Walker. Your ladyship, my dear, if they fix on that way of speaking, you must just let me practice a little on you first, for I shall feel so foolish and hot saying it the first time to Lady Glenmire." It was really a relief to Miss Mattie when Miss Jameson came on a very unpolite errand. I noticed that apathetic people have more quiet impertinence than others, and Miss Jameson came now to institute pretty plainly that she did not particularly wish that the Cranford ladies should call upon her sister-in-law. I can hardly say how she made this clear, for I grew very indignant and warm, while with slow deliberation she was explaining her wishes to Miss Mattie, who, a true lady herself, could hardly understand the feeling which made Miss Jameson wish to appear to her noble sister-in-law as if she only visited county families. Miss Mattie remained puzzled and perplexed long after I had found out the object of Miss Jameson's visit. When she did understand the drift of the honorable lady's call, it was pretty to see with what quiet dignity she received the intimation thus uncourteously given. She was not in the least hurt. She was of too gentle a spirit for that, nor was she exactly conscious of disapproving of Miss Jameson's conduct. But there was something of this feeling in her mind, I am sure, which made her pass from the subject to others in a less flurried and more composed manner than usual. Miss Jameson was, indeed, the more flurried of the two, and I could see she was glad to take her leave. A little while afterwards Miss Pole returned, red and indignant. "Well, to be sure, you've had Miss Jameson here, I find from Martha, and we are not to call on Lady Glenmire." "Yes, I met Miss Jameson halfway between here and Miss Forrester's, and she told me. She took me so by surprise, I had nothing to say. I wish I had thought of something very sharp and sarcastic. I dare say I shall tonight, and Lady Glenmire is but the widow of a Scotch baron after all. I went on to look at Miss Forrester's peerage, to see who this lady was, that is, to be kept under a glass case, widow of a Scotch peer, never sat in the House of Lords, and as poor as Job, I dare say, and she, fifth daughter of some Mr. Campbell or other. You are the daughter of a rector, at any rate, and related to the Arleys, and Sir Peter might have been Viscount Arley, everyone says." Miss Mattie tried to soothe Miss Pole, but in vain. That lady, usually so kind and good-humoured, was now in a full flow of anger. "And I went and ordered a cap this morning, to be quite ready." And she at last letting out the secret which gave sting to Miss Jameson's intimation, "Miss Jameson shall see if it is so easy to get me to make forth at a pool, when she has none of her fine Scotch relations with her." In coming out of church, the first Sunday on which Lady Glenmire appeared in Cranford, we sedulously talked together, and turned our backs on Miss Jameson and her guest. If we might not call on her, we would not even look at her, though we were dying with curiosity to know what she was like. We had the comfort of questioning Martha in the afternoon. Martha did not belong to a sphere of society whose observation could be an implied compliment to Lady Glenmire, and Martha had made good use of her eyes. "Well, ma'am, is it the little lady with Miss Jameson you mean? I thought you would like to know how young Miss Smith was dressed, her being a bride." Miss Smith was a butcher's wife. Miss Pole said, "Good gracious me!" as if we cared about a Miss Smith, but was silent as Martha resumed her speech. The little lady in Miss Jameson's pew had on rather an old black silk and a shepherd's plaid cloak, ma'am, and very bright black eyes she had, ma'am, and a pleasant sharp face, not over young, ma'am, but yet, I should guess, younger than Miss Jameson herself. She looked up and down the church like a bird, and nipped up her petticoats when she came out, as quick and sharp as I've ever seen. I'll tell you what, ma'am, she's more like Miss Deacon, at the Coach and Horses, nor any one." "Hush, Martha," said Miss Mattie, "that's not respectful." "Isn't it, ma'am? I beg pardon, I'm sure, but Jim Hearn said so as well. He says she was just such a sharp, stern sort of a body." "Lady," said Miss Pole, "lady as Miss Deacon." Another Sunday passed away, and we still averted our eyes from Miss Jameson and her guests, and made remarks to ourselves that we thought were very severe, almost too much so. Miss Mattie was evidently uneasy at our sarcastic manner of speaking. Perhaps by this time Lady Glenmire had found out that Miss Jameson was not the gayest, liveliest house in the world. Perhaps Miss Jameson had found out that most of the county families were in London, and that those who remained in the country were not so alive as they might have been to the circumstance of Lady Glenmire being in the neighborhood. Great events spring out of small causes, So I will not pretend to say what induced Miss Jameson to alter her determination of excluding the Cranford ladies, and send notes of invitation all round